Hi, Brad Bob here again with Federal Retirement Planning, and today I want to talk about what happens when a federal employee or federal retiree dies and they have a TSP account. Okay, and I'm talking here today about married couples. So, what happens if a federal employee dies, a retiree, and that money passes on to their spouse? Okay, so a federal employee's or retiree spouse is the only person that can keep money in TSP once the account holder dies. So, and that is known as what's called a beneficiary participant account, okay, or BPA is the acronym for it. And how's that work? It works just like TSP does for the account holder. So it's just moved to a beneficiary participant account. Money stays in there. They can change funds, do interfund transfers, take distributions just like the account holder could. But there's one big hiccup with BPAs, and that is that upon the BPA account holder's death, the money in there has to be taken out within, I believe it's a 60-day window. So it has to be taken out right away. Why is that a big deal? That is a big deal because if you're passing money on to, say, kids, and let's say there's $1 million in TSP, that suddenly becomes $1 million of taxable income, okay? Where if it were an IRA, you would likely have a 10-year window or more for the beneficiary to take those funds out. So in other words, they could take that $1 million and spread it out over a 10-year time period and most likely reduce the taxes that would be paid on that account versus taking it all out in a 60-day time period. So that's a big deal. And that is not to be underestimated. That could easily save tens of thousands of dollars, if not into the six figures on bigger accounts. So what's the next option? Next option is an inherited IRA. Can't spell today. Inherited IRA, and then there's an IRA. Okay? So these are the two other options, okay? You can move to a BPA, or you can move the funds to an inherited IRA or an IRA, all right? These are similar yet different. So benefits of moving to the inherited IRA is, let's say that the surviving spouse is 50 years old and the spouse that dies is whatever, 52, okay? If funds are moved to the inherited IRA, then the surviving spouse that's 50 years old would have access to these funds, all right? So surviving spouse would have access to these funds where that spouse would not have access to their own qualified funds, IRAs, TSP, Roth IRAs. So that is a really big benefit, okay? And then funds can be left there, and the surviving spouse does not have to take distributions until the year that the deceased would turn age 72, okay? So in the scenario we're talking about, the deceased died at age 52, so that money could stay there for 20 years until funds had to be taken out of it, which would be RMDs, required minimum distributions. So that's one benefit. Another big benefit, okay? Funds are in here. The new account holder of the inherited IRA passes. They now have 10 years to take the money out according to the Secure Act, okay? That is the same way with moving money to an IRA. Is the new account holders, the beneficiaries, would have 10 years. The beneficiaries, the money would pass on to, would have 10 years to take the money out, okay? So that is a huge, huge plus for each of these two. Let's say another scenario, okay? Or let's talk about the IRA first. The money from TSP, or if money was in an IRA, it could be transferred to your own IRA, okay? So the surviving spouse can transfer funds to their own IRA. I wouldn't recommend doing that in the scenario we just talked about, a 50 and 52-year-old, unless the 50-year-old had plenty of access to other funds. There's really no harm in leaving money in an inherited IRA, because the inherited IRA can always be transferred to your own IRA. There's no time limit on doing that. Moving it to an IRA, I mean, really the reason to do that would be, let's say you're already 60 years old, so you have access to your IRA funds. Then it may be worthwhile to move money to the inherited IRA for simplification, okay? Making it easier on your beneficiaries. Let's see, another scenario where it may make sense to keep the inherited IRA. Let's say that the person that passes is 60 years old, the surviving spouse is 70, and the surviving spouse doesn't need to take distributions from, TSP or whatever, the inherited IRA. They just don't need to take distributions. Well, the surviving spouse may want to leave the money in an inherited IRA because that person wouldn't be forced to take money out until when the deceased would have turned age 72. Okay? So there's a couple different scenarios where it may make sense to keep money in the inherited IRA, or I guess move money from TSP to an inherited IRA. There's some scenarios where it makes sense to move money to an IRA. Also, qualified charitable distributions can be done from an inherited IRA when the account holder is age 70 and a half or older. That cannot be done from TSP. So lots of advantages. There's other advantages as far as investment options, as far as flexibility with withdrawals, stuff like that, within an inherited IRA and IRA. So there's a number of benefits of moving money from a TSP to inherited IRA or IRA. But if you love TSP, you can keep it in a beneficiary participant account. Keep in mind, though, that any beneficiaries inheriting money from a BPA are going to have to take money out right away when the account holder dies, okay? And that could cost the beneficiaries thousands and thousands of dollars in taxes. I'll put a link to, wrote an article about this too, which may make it a little easier to see it written down in written form. And there's a number of rules here talking about eligible designated beneficiaries. Odds are I forgot something, but these are the main points, okay? Know the differences, know the benefits and drawbacks of a TSP beneficiary participant account, of an inherited IRA, and an IRA, okay? And then proceed accordingly should you have the unfortunate situation of losing a spouse. Thanks.